The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Harrison Park, where families and joggers filled the lush green trails. Laughter from children playing soccer echoed through the air, blending with the chirping of birds. It was a scene of peace, one that Daniel Lawson had missed dearly. Having just returned from a 7-month deployment, Daniel was eager to enjoy the simple pleasures of civilian life. As a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, his days were usually spent aboard warships, in strategy meetings, or commanding missions in distant waters. But at home, he was just Daniel, a man who valued quiet moments, a good run, and time with his family. Dressed in a gray workout shirt and black running shorts, he jogged steadily along the park's winding path. His powerful yet controlled strides reflected the discipline he had honed over years of service. He loved the sense of freedom that running gave him. No orders, no protocols, just the rhythm of his breath and the earth beneath his feet. As he passed a group of kids kicking around a soccer ball, a misfired shot sent the ball rolling into his path. Daniel stopped, picked it up, and tossed it back with a friendly nod. The boy who retrieved it beamed. Moments like these reminded Daniel why he served, to protect this way of life. But peace, as he would soon find out, was short-lived. Rounding a bend in the trail, Daniel accidentally bumped shoulders with a passing man. It was a light collision, nothing forceful, but enough to make both of them stumble slightly. "My apologies, sir," Daniel said immediately, his voice calm and polite. The man, a stocky, broad-shouldered police officer in his early 50s, stopped in his tracks and turned toward Daniel with a scowl. His name tag read, "B. Moore." "Are you blind?" the officer snapped, looking Daniel up and down with clear disdain. Daniel blinked, momentarily taken aback by the aggression in the man's tone. He had expected a simple nod or maybe a casual, "no worries." Instead, he was met with hostility. "I wasn't paying attention. I hope you're okay," Daniel responded, maintaining a composed demeanor. Officer Bradley Moore crossed his arms. His gaze held something more than irritation. It was contempt. "You people never watch where you're going, do you?" he sneered. Daniel felt a familiar tension settle in his chest. He had encountered this type of prejudice before, both in uniform and out of it. He had learned to stay calm, to pick his battles. "Sir, there's no need for that," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. "I apologized. Let's move on." But Bradley wasn't interested in moving on. He took a step closer, deliberately invading Daniel's space. "You think you can just bump into people and walk away? You don't belong here anyway." Daniel's jaw tightened. The park was public. He lived just a few blocks away. Yet to men like Bradley, his presence was an offense. Nearby, a few people had started to notice the tension. Some slowed their pace, curiosity flickering in their eyes. A woman sitting on a bench pulled out her phone, her brows furrowed. Daniel inhaled deeply, keeping his posture relaxed. He had been trained to de-escalate conflict, but something told him that Bradley didn't want peace. "I don't want any trouble, officer," Daniel said evenly. "If you'll excuse me, I'll be on my way." He took a step to leave, but Bradley blocked his path. "Oh, you'll leave when I say you can leave." Daniel exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. The crowd around them continued to grow. Whispers spread. A few people pulled out their phones, sensing something was about to happen. And Daniel? He had faced down warships, hostile territories, and high-stakes negotiations. But the arrogance of a small-minded man with a badge, that too was a battle he had fought before. Little did Officer Bradley Moore know. This time, his actions would cost him everything. The air around them had changed. What started as a minor collision had now turned into a confrontation, drawing more eyes by the second. Daniel Lawson, ever the composed man, could feel the weight of the moment. He had been in hostile situations before, facing enemies on the battlefield, negotiating under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a war zone. This was his own neighborhood, in a park where families came to unwind. And yet here he was, staring into the narrowed, angry eyes of a man who saw him not as a fellow citizen, but as a problem. Bradley Moore's stance was rigid, his jaw tight. He wasn't just angry, he was challenged. He had expected Daniel to bow his head, mumble another apology, and walk away quickly. Instead, Daniel remained firm, unshaken, refusing to shrink under his gaze. That, more than the accidental bump, infuriated him. "What's the matter? You don't like being told what to do?" Bradley sneered, taking another step forward. Daniel didn't move. His 6-foot frame was solid, but he made no aggressive gestures. His hands remained open at his sides, a habit ingrained in him from years of military training to show he was not a threat. "I told you, I don't want any trouble," Daniel said, his voice calm but unwavering. Bradley chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I bet you don't. You people always act all polite, thinking that makes you different. But I see right through it." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A young man nearby muttered, "This is messed up." An older woman pulled out her phone and started recording. Bradley noticed. His lips curled into a smirk. He wasn't afraid of being recorded. In his mind, he had authority. He was the law here. "Think that phone's gonna save you?" Bradley scoffed, nodding toward the woman with the camera. "Go ahead, record. But when I take you in, they'll only see a cop doing his job." Daniel felt the sharp sting of those words. Take me in? For what? He had done nothing wrong, but he knew exactly what Bradley was doing. He wanted control. "I have no intention of causing a scene, officer," Daniel said, carefully choosing his words. "I'd appreciate it if you let me go about my day." Bradley's smirk faded. He didn't like the way Daniel spoke. Measured, respectful, but in control. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. He wanted fear. He wanted obedience. Instead, he was getting neither. Without warning, Bradley reached out and shoved Daniel hard. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The camera phones zoomed in. Daniel staggered slightly but caught himself with ease. His instinct told him to react, but years of training had taught him to master his emotions. He squared his shoulders, standing taller instead of backing down. "There was no need for that, officer," Daniel said, his voice lower now. A warning. Bradley's eyes darkened. "Oh, you didn't like that? What, you think you're too good to be touched?" Daniel didn't answer. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, not from fear, but from controlled anger. He knew exactly what Bradley wanted, a reaction, an excuse. The murmurs turned to voices of concern. "He didn't do anything," a woman called out. "That's assault," another voice shouted. Bradley's fingers curled into fists. He was losing control of the situation, his authority, his power. None of it was working the way he wanted. Daniel was still calm, still collected, and now there were too many witnesses. And then, in a split second of pure frustration, Bradley reached for his gun. The air became electric. A scream rang out. "Oh my God, he's got a gun!" The park, once filled with laughter and joy, was now frozen in horror. Children clung to their parents. People backed away, hands raised. The crowd, once passive observers, were now terrified witnesses. But Daniel? Daniel stood his ground. He had faced loaded weapons before, but this time, he wasn't on a distant battlefield. This time, his enemy was wearing a badge. The world around them seemed to freeze. The barrel of Bradley Moore's gun was locked onto Daniel's chest, his fingers tense on the grip. The gleam of metal under the afternoon sun sent a ripple of terror through the onlookers. A woman let out a shriek. A father yanked his child behind him. Nearby, a man whispered, "Jesus Christ, he's really gonna shoot him." Daniel didn't move. He had faced weapons before, snipers in foreign lands, enemies in the dead of night, but never in his own neighborhood, from a man sworn to protect. His heartbeat remained steady, but his mind raced. One wrong move, one twitch, and Bradley might pull the trigger. He kept his hands open and visible, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, lower your weapon. You don't want to do this." Bradley's breathing was heavy. His hands shook slightly, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of this many people. "Shut up! You don't get to tell me what to do," he barked, his finger tightening on the trigger. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "This is insane," someone yelled. "Put the gun down, man," another voice pleaded. A man in a business suit took a step forward, hands raised. "Officer, you need to calm down. He hasn't done anything." Bradley shot the man a glare. "Stay out of this." His face was flushed, his eyes wild, as if he wasn't in control anymore. Daniel knew that look. He had seen it before. a man drowning in his own fear, hiding behind power. Bradley was losing control, and that made him dangerous. "Listen to them, officer," Daniel said, his voice unwavering. "There are witnesses. People are recording." Think Bradley flinched at those words. His gaze flicked to the sea of camera phones pointed at him. He swallowed hard. Too late. The world was watching. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His mind was spinning. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the one in charge. He was the law. And yet somehow, this man in front of him still held the power. And Bradley hated it. His grip on the gun tightened. Daniel inhaled slowly. If Bradley fired, he wouldn't have time to dodge. The wrong breath, the wrong twitch, and his life could be over. But Daniel didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't cower. Instead, he did something Bradley never expected. He reached into his pocket. Bradley's pulse spiked. "Don't move," he barked. His finger was so tight on the trigger now that just a tremor could set it off. The crowd screamed. But Daniel was calm, deliberate, controlled. He pulled out his phone, slowly, carefully, never breaking eye contact with Bradley. And then, in a voice steady as steel, he spoke into the receiver. "This is Rear Admiral Daniel Lawson." Bradley's breath caught in his throat. "I need an officer at Harrison Park immediately. There is a situation involving a hostile officer pulling a firearm on an unarmed citizen." The silence was deafening. The crowd stared. The words Daniel had just spoken seemed to crash over Bradley like a tidal wave. "Rear Admiral?" His throat went dry. Bradley had spent years in law enforcement. He had worked around military personnel before, but never at that rank. A Rear Admiral wasn't just anyone. They commanded fleets. They advised presidents. They were untouchable, and he had just pulled a gun on one. Panic flooded his chest. His fingers twitched on the trigger. "You're lying," Bradley spat, but his voice wavered. Daniel didn't blink, didn't move. The call was still active. And then, over the speakerphone, a voice boomed. "This is Chief Richard Bennett. Who the hell just pointed a gun at Admiral Lawson?" The second Bradley heard the police chief's voice, his stomach dropped. The weight of what he had done finally crashed down on him. His hands shook. His body stiffened. His future unraveled in real time. Daniel took a step closer, his voice low but dangerous. "Now, Officer Moore, tell me again, who do you think you are?" Bradley's gun lowered. The sound of approaching sirens filled the park. The world was about to collapse around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The wail of approaching sirens cut through the thick tension in the air. Officer Bradley Moore's grip on his gun loosened, his hand trembling as he lowered it to his side. His face, once smug and full of authority, had drained of color. The reality of what he had just done, pulling a gun on a Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, was sinking in fast. Daniel Lawson remained where he was, shoulders squared, his breathing even. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home. And yet in that moment, he was still forced to defend himself, not with fists, not with weapons, but with composure. A black SUV skidded to a stop at the park entrance, its doors swinging open almost before the vehicle had fully stopped. Chief Richard Bennett, a tall graying man with a commanding presence, stepped out. His face was set in a hard scowl as he surveyed the scene. Daniel standing calm and composed, Bradley Moore standing stiff, gun still in hand, and a crowd of horrified onlookers holding up their phones, having captured everything. "Jesus Christ," Bennett muttered under his breath before striding forward. "Moore!" His voice boomed, snapping the officer out of his stunned daze. "Put the damn gun away!" Bradley flinched and quickly holstered his weapon, but the damage was done. The weight of 100 eyes was on him, along with the cold judgment in his superior's gaze. Bennett turned to Daniel, his expression shifting from fury to something almost apologetic. "Admiral Lawson," he said, voice steady but edged with frustration. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Chief," Daniel replied, though there was a steeliness in his tone. "I'd like to know what your officer planned to do with that weapon, though." Bennett turned sharply toward Bradley. "That's exactly what I'd like to know." His glare was enough to make Bradley stiffen. "Sir, Bradley started, but Bennett held up a hand. "Shut up," he snapped. "Not another goddamn word." He looked toward the nearest officer on the scene. "Cuff him!" The entire park seemed to gasp at once. Bradley's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, wait! You pointed a gun at an unarmed citizen in broad daylight," Bennett barked. "A citizen who happens to be a goddamn rear admiral. I don't give a damn what your excuse is. You're under arrest for reckless endangerment and unlawful use of force." Two officers stepped forward. Bradley recoiled as one of them grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back. "This is a mistake," Bradley gritted out, struggling against their grip. I told you to shut up," Bennett snapped. "You're done talking." The handcuffs clicked into place. Bradley, the man who had strutted through the park minutes ago, thinking he could intimidate whoever he pleased, was now being led toward a squad car, his face red with humiliation. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Some cheered. Others just shook their heads. Daniel watched, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no gloating, only disappointment. "You want me to come in and give a statement?" Daniel asked Bennett. Bennett shook his head. "Not right now. We have plenty of witness accounts and video evidence. This one's open and shut." He hesitated, then added, "But I do want to formally apologize. This shouldn't have happened." Daniel met his gaze. "No," he said, voice calm but firm. "It shouldn't have." Bennett exhaled and ran a hand over his face. "I need to get back to the station. There's gonna be hell to pay." "I imagine so," Daniel said before turning away. He didn't need to watch Bradley get shoved into the back of the squad car. He had already won the only battle that mattered. As he walked away, he heard a voice in the crowd say, "That could have ended differently." Yes, Daniel thought. It very well could have. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, and concerned citizens filled every seat, their eyes locked onto the man sitting at the defense table, former officer Bradley Moore. Gone was the arrogant smirk he had worn that day in the park. His uniform was replaced by a gray suit, his expression hollow. He knew what was coming. Everyone did. At the witness stand, Daniel Lawson sat tall and composed. The prosecutor paced before him, glancing at the jury before speaking. "Admiral Lawson," she began, "on the afternoon of April 17th, you were jogging in Harrison Park when you encountered the defendant. Can you tell the court what happened?" Daniel's voice was steady. "I accidentally bumped into Officer Moore. I immediately apologized, but instead of accepting it, he escalated the situation, verbally and physically." "You say physically. Can you clarify?" "He shoved me," Daniel said plainly. "When I didn't react the way he expected, he pulled his firearm and aimed it at my chest." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably as if imagining themselves in his position. "And at that moment," the prosecutor continued, "what was going through your mind?" Daniel exhaled. "I've faced weapons before, but never from an officer of the law in my own neighborhood. I knew I had to stay calm, or I might not have walked away that day." The prosecutor nodded, then turned toward the jury. "Let's be clear. An armed, uniformed officer aimed his gun at an unarmed man who had done absolutely nothing wrong. A man who has spent his life serving this country, defending its freedoms. But in that moment, in the eyes of the defendant, all that mattered was the color of his skin." Bradley's lawyer stood. "Objection, speculation." The judge barely looked up. "Overruled." The prosecutor approached the jury box. "The truth is, if Admiral Lawson had reacted even slightly differently, we might not be here today. We might be in another courtroom, discussing why an innocent man was gunned down in a public park, and that should terrify us all." A heavy silence settled over the room. The weight of those words was undeniable. The trial had been swift. The evidence, damning. Video recordings from multiple angles had captured everything. Bradley shoving Daniel, pulling his gun, the fear in the crowd, the instant regret on his face when he realized who he had threatened. There was no spinning the truth. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. "On the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of unlawful use of a firearm, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of power, we find the defendant guilty." Bradley Moore slumped in his chair, his face ashen. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked at him with unapologetic sternness. "Officer Moore, your actions were not just reckless, they were dangerous. Your duty was to protect and serve, but instead you abused your badge to exert control over an innocent man. You escalated a harmless situation into a life-threatening one, and now you will face the consequences. She cleared her throat. I hereby sentence you to 5 years in state prison. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Bradley's head snapped up in shock. His lawyer whispered furiously, but it was over. A former cop was going to prison. Daniel watched without triumph or satisfaction, only a sense of finality. Justice had been served, but the fight wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him. A young journalist pushed her microphone forward. Admiral Lawson, do you have any final thoughts? Daniel looked past the cameras, past the flashing lights, and straight into the eyes of the nation. I've served this country for over 30 years, he said. I've defended the ideals of justice and freedom across the world. But justice and freedom don't mean much if they're not applied equally. What happened to me is not an isolated event. It's part of a larger problem, one we can't keep ignoring. He took a deep breath. No one should be above the law, not even those who wear a badge. And no one should have to fear for their life because of the color of their skin. I don't want vengeance. I want change. For a moment, there was silence. Then, applause. The video of his speech went viral that night. It sparked conversations across the country, forced police departments to review their policies, and made people think twice about who they trusted with power. As for Bradley Moore, his time in prison would not be easy. Ex-cops behind bars were rarely welcomed. He had spent years exerting control over others. Now he had none. And Daniel Lawson? He went back to doing what he had always done, serving, leading, inspiring, because some battles are won in the field, but the most important ones are won at home.